It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the day I had envisioned for years. My wedding in Chicago, surrounded by family and friends, was meant to be a joyful celebration of love and unity. Instead, it became a day that shattered my trust and left me questioning everything. The ceremony was breathtaking. The music flowed beautifully, the floral arrangements were flawless, and the guests beamed with happiness. As I walked down the aisle, my heart swelled with excitement. Peter and I had poured months of effort into making this day perfect, and I couldn't wait to officially begin our life together. The reception started off well. Guests danced, laughed, and shared heartfelt toasts. But as the evening unfolded, an unexpected tension began to creep in. It all started when Peter's mother, Mrs. Johnson, approached me with a stern expression. A woman in her late 50s with a commanding presence, she always seemed to dominate any room she entered. "Scarlett," she said, her tone sharp and dripping with disdain. "We need to talk. Now." Confused but wanting to avoid a scene, I followed her to a quieter corner of the venue. Maybe it was a minor issue, I thought something easy to resolve. But the anger in her eyes told me otherwise. "You have been utterly disrespectful today," she hissed, her voice low but filled with venom. "Do you have any idea how much you've embarrassed me in front of our guests?" Her accusation hit me like a slap. "Ich sagte her, stunt." I had been nothing but polite and welcoming all day, carefully navigating the high expectations she always set. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady and calm. "Can you tell me what I've done wrong?" She waved away my question, her face reddening. "Don't play innocent with me. You ignored my seating suggestions, you didn't consult me on the menu, and worst of all, you chose that dress. I specifically told you it would clash with the family color scheme." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wedding gown was a classic, elegant choice I had fallen in love with months ago. It wasn't extravagant or inappropriate. How could something so personal, my own dress, be the source of such outrage? "I thought this was my wedding day," I said carefully, my chest tightening. "Peter and I made these decisions together. We wanted this day to reflect us as a couple." Mrs. Johnson scoffed, crossing her arms. "You're marrying into our family now, Scarlett. This isn't just about you. It's about upholding our image, our traditions. But clearly you don't care about that." Her words cut deep, but before I could respond, Peter appeared. I breathed a sigh of relief, expecting him to step in and diffuse the situation. Instead, he stood silently, his eyes darting nervously between his mother and me. "Peter," I said, my voice trembling, "your mother thinks I've embarrassed her today. Can you please explain that these decisions were ours?" But Peter didn't defend me. He shrugged and muttered, "Maybe you should have listened to her. Scarlett, she does have a point." The ground seemed to shift beneath me. This was the man I was marrying? The one who vowed to stand by me, who promised we were a team. His refusal to back me up in such a moment of humiliation left me feeling betrayed and alone. Mrs. Johnson smirked, clearly pleased with Peter's response. "See? Even Peter agrees. You've already started this marriage on the wrong foot, Scarlett." Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of her. "Excuse me," I said, turning on my heel and walking away, my heart pounding. As I moved through the crowd, the joyous atmosphere of the day felt like a cruel joke. I smiled politely at the guests who tried to stop and congratulate me, but inside, I felt like I was suffocating. How could the happiest day of my life turn into a nightmare so quickly? I escaped to an empty room, locking the door behind me. As I sank onto a chair, I realized this wasn't just about the wedding, it was about the life I was about to step into. A life where my feelings would always come second to Mrs. Johnson's overbearing demands and Peter's inability to stand up for me. In that quiet room, away from the laughter and music, I made a decision. This wasn't how my story would continue. The world seemed to stop. My cheek burned, not just from Peter's slap, but from the searing humiliation of being attacked in front of everyone. My chest tightened, And I struggled to breathe as the weight of his words, his cruelty, sank in. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, while others averted their eyes. No one stepped forward to defend me. Mrs. Johnson stood with her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face. It was clear that she saw this moment as her victory. "You've disgraced me," Peter sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I should never have married someone like you." I felt the sting of his words more than the slap itself. My mind raced, replaying all the moments that led up to this, how I had ignored the red flags, how I had let myself believe that love would overcome his family's toxicity. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined. Slowly, I straightened my back, refusing to let them see me break. "You're right, Peter," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "You shouldn't have married me, and I shouldn't have married you." Gasps rippled through the room, but I didn't care. The humiliation I felt was quickly being replaced by a surge of anger and determination. I turned to the guests, family, friends, strangers who had stood by and watched. "You all saw what just happened," I said, my voice growing stronger. "And not one of you said or did anything. Not one of you stood up for me. That tells me everything I need to know about this family and this marriage." Peter's face twisted with rage, and he stepped closer, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," I warned, my voice ice cold. "You've done enough." Then, turning to Mrs. Johnson, I locked eyes with her. "You've hated me from the start, haven't you? You couldn't stand that your son loved someone who didn't fit your perfect mold. Well, congratulations, you've won. Because I'm done." Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving behind the shocked silence, the whispers, and the stares. The cold Chicago air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. I had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. I deserved better than this. Better than Peter. Better than his mother. Better than a family that thrived on cruelty and control. This wasn't how I envisioned my wedding day ending, but maybe it was a blessing in disguise. I would rebuild, stronger and wiser, and I would never let anyone treat me like that again. Detective Robert Hayes came highly recommended. When I met him at his small but well-organized office, I felt a flicker of hope. Hayes was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and an air of quiet confidence. He listened intently as I recounted the events of my wedding and the months leading up to it, taking careful notes. "I'll need access to your communication records, financial documents, and any messages from Peter or his mother," he said. "The more evidence we have, the better." I handed over what I had. Screenshots of degrading text messages from Mrs. Johnson, financial statements showing how much I had contributed to the wedding expenses, and a diary where I'd written about incidents of emotional abuse. Hayes nodded approvingly. "This is a good start," he said. "I'll begin digging into their financials and look for any patterns of manipulation or misconduct. If there's anything shady, we'll find it." Over the next few weeks, Hayes uncovered more than I could have imagined. Peter and his mother had a long history of exploiting people financially, from unpaid debts to dubious business dealings. Mrs. Johnson had a reputation for pressuring family members into loans that she never intended to repay. And Peter? He had a secret bank account with significant withdrawals that didn't align with his supposed income. The most shocking discovery was that Peter had taken out a loan in my name without my consent. Hayes handed me the evidence, a trail of forged signatures and falsified documents. My stomach churned as I realized the extent of their betrayal. "They've been using you, Scarlett," Hayes said, his tone empathetic but firm. "But now you have the power to fight back." Armed with the evidence, I consulted with a lawyer. The forgery alone was grounds for a serious legal case, and the emotional abuse added weight to my claims. My lawyer recommended filing for an annulment rather than a divorce, given the fraudulent nature of the marriage. When the papers were served to Peter, he called me, his tone dripping with faux remorse. "Scarlett, can we talk?" he pleaded. "We can fix this. Mom was out of line, but she's just protective. You know how she is." I cut him off. You didn't just stand by while she humiliated me, Peter. You participated. And now I know about the loan. Don't bother trying to deny it, I have proof. There was a long pause before he responded, his voice turning cold. You'll regret this. But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. The annulment case garnered attention when my lawyer presented the evidence of forgery and financial abuse in court. Mrs. Johnson's smug demeanor cracked as she realized the depth of the trouble they were in. Peter, too, looked shaken as his lies and manipulations were laid bare for everyone to see. The judge ruled in my favor, nullifying the marriage and ordering Peter to repay the fraudulent loan. He and his mother were left to deal with the legal consequences of their actions, including potential charges for the forgery. For the first time in months, I felt free. In the aftermath, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I started therapy to process the trauma and began volunteering at a local organization that supported survivors of abuse. Sharing my story with others who had faced similar challenges was cathartic and empowering. One sunny afternoon, as I walked past a cafe near my new apartment, I saw a small group of women chatting and laughing. They reminded me of the joy and connection I had once hoped to find in my marriage. But instead of feeling regret, I felt a sense of peace. My life wasn't what I had planned, but it was mine now, and that was enough. Peter and his mother had tried to break me, but they had failed. Instead, they had awakened a strength I hadn't known I possessed. And with that strength, I was determined to write the next chapter of my life, on my own terms. With each recording, the pattern of abuse became more apparent. Peter's cutting remarks and Mrs. Johnson's manipulative tactics were a stark reminder of how much control they had exerted over my life. Listening back to the recordings was painful, but it also fueled my determination to break free and seek justice. Detective Hayes worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence. Along with my recordings, he unearthed financial records showing how Peter and his mother had benefited from my contributions. They had used my money to fund their extravagant lifestyles while belittling me at every opportunity. It was infuriating to see in black and white just how much I had been exploited. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from Mrs. Johnson herself. During a conversation I recorded, she admitted her true feelings about me. "You'll never be good enough for my son," she sneered. "You're just here to make our lives easier. If Peter hadn't married you, we wouldn't have to deal with your pathetic attempts to fit in." When Hayes heard this recording, he shook his head. "This is exactly the kind of material we need. It shows clear intent to demean and control you. Combined with the financial evidence, it builds a strong case." With the evidence in hand, I filed for an annulment, citing emotional and financial abuse. My lawyer was confident that we had a strong case, and I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't experienced in years. The court date approached quickly, and I was both nervous and resolute. Peter and Mrs. Johnson arrived with their own lawyer, their faces tense and defensive. Seeing them made my stomach churn, but I reminded myself why I was doing this, to reclaim my life and hold them accountable. When my lawyer played the recordings in court, the room was silent except for the sound of Peter's and Mrs. Johnson's voices. Their words were harsh and damning, and I saw the judge's expression harden as he listened. My lawyer also presented the financial evidence, detailing how they had manipulated me into footing the bill for their expenses while offering nothing in return. Peter's lawyer tried to paint me as overly sensitive and incapable of handling a tough love relationship, but the recordings spoke for themselves. No one could justify the venom and manipulation I had endured. When it was my turn to speak, I addressed the court with as much composure as I could muster. "This was never about love or partnership," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "It was about control. They saw me as a resource, not a person, and I refused to let them continue to exploit me." After hours of testimony and evidence, the judge delivered his decision. The annulment was granted, and Peter and Mrs. Johnson were ordered to repay a significant portion of the money they had taken from me. They left the courtroom furious and humiliated, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt free. The victory was bittersweet. It didn't erase the pain of what I had been through, but it gave me the closure I needed to move forward. I had faced my abusers head-on and come out stronger. With the annulment finalized, I started to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, surrounded myself with supportive friends, and began therapy to heal from the trauma. Slowly but surely, I rediscovered my sense of self-worth. One day, I found myself walking past a bakery, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. I stepped inside, ordered a pastry, and sat down to savor it. As I looked out the window at the bustling city, I realized how far I had come. I wasn't defined by my past or the people who tried to tear me down. I was free, and I was determined to live the life I deserved. Detective Hayes continued digging into Peter and Mrs. Johnson's financial dealings while Anna and I worked tirelessly to organize the mountain of evidence. The deeper we delved, the clearer the picture became. Peter and his mother were exploiting others just as they had tried to exploit me. One afternoon, Hayes called with an update. "I've traced some of the funds to offshore accounts," he said. "They've been funneling money through shell companies. It's textbook embezzlement, and there's a trail leading right to them." The weight of his words settled on me. This wasn't just about reclaiming my dignity anymore. It was about holding them accountable for the harm they'd caused others. Anna and I decided to compile everything into a comprehensive report. She used her connections to reach out to a forensic accountant who confirmed the fraudulent activity in Peter's business dealings. Armed with the recordings, financial records, and the accountant's findings, we were ready to take the next step. Our first move was to report the financial crimes to the authorities. Detective Hayes helped us prepare the case for law enforcement, ensuring every detail was accounted for. We filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office, presenting our evidence alongside Hayes' findings. As we waited for the investigation to unfold, Anna suggested another bold move. "Why don't we expose them publicly?" she said. "It's not just about the money. They've hurt people emotionally, too. Their clients and your community deserve to know the truth." The idea terrified me, but it also felt right. These were people who thrived on secrecy and manipulation. Shedding light on their actions could prevent them from preying on others. Anna helped me draft a statement for social media, carefully worded to share my story without defaming anyone outright. I detailed the abuse, hinted at the financial misconduct, and ended with a message of empowerment. No one deserves to be manipulated or silenced. Speak up. Reclaim your power. The post went viral within hours. People reached out with messages of support, sharing their own experiences with toxic relationships and fraudulent business dealings. Some even recognized Peter and Mrs. Johnson, claiming they had been victims of their schemes. When Peter and Mrs. Johnson saw the post, their reaction was swift and furious. Peter called me repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails. "You've ruined everything," he shouted in one. "You'll regret this, Scarlett." Mrs. Johnson sent a scathing email, accusing me of lying and threatening to sue for defamation. But they didn't scare me anymore. I forwarded the messages to Detective Hayes and my lawyer, who assured me that their threats were empty. The truth was on my side, and the evidence spoke louder than their lies. A few weeks later, the police raided Peter's office. The evidence of fraud was undeniable, and both Peter and Mrs. Johnson were arrested. The trial that followed revealed the full extent of their crimes. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from unsuspecting clients, using their charm and deceit to cover their tracks. The judge sentenced them to prison, and their assets were seized to repay their victims. Watching them taken away in handcuffs felt like the closure I had been waiting for. With the nightmare behind me, I focused on rebuilding my life. Anna and I launched a podcast to empower others to recognize and escape toxic relationships. I poured my energy into helping those who had been hurt, using my experience to make a difference. Through it all, I learned that strength doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from facing it head-on. The path to justice was painful, but it also freed me to live a life unburdened by manipulation and fear. And as for Peter and Mrs. Johnson, they now had plenty of time to reflect on their actions behind bars. As the evening began, I stepped up to the podium, my heart pounding. The room quieted, and all eyes turned to me. Peter and Mrs. Johnson stood near the front, their expressions smug, believing this was just another celebration to enhance their public image. I took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady despite the nerves. "I've gathered you here to share a story that has been both painful and empowering. It's a story of betrayal, manipulation, and resilience." The murmurs in the audience quieted as the gravity of my words settled over the room. For years, I endured emotional abuse and control at the hands of Peter and Mrs. Johnson. I continued, meeting their surprised gazes. I gave everything to this marriage, only to discover that it was built on lies. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Peter's confident smile faded, replaced by confusion and anger. Mrs. Johnson crossed her arms, her face tight with disapproval. "I've spent months gathering evidence that exposes the truth about what they've done. Not just to me, but to others as well," I said, signaling to Anna, who was stationed at the back of the room. The lights dimmed, and a screen descended from the ceiling. A presentation began, showing the financial records Detective Hayes had uncovered. Each slide revealed damning evidence of Peter and Mrs. Johnson's fraudulent activities, embezzlement, stolen funds, and their elaborate scheme to cover it up. The room erupted in whispers and gasps as the audience processed the magnitude of the revelations. Peter and Mrs. Johnson looked visibly shaken, their earlier confidence crumbling. "I trusted them," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "And they betrayed not only me but so many others. Tonight, I'm here to take back my power and expose the truth." Anna stepped forward with a microphone, addressing the crowd. "The evidence you've seen tonight has been submitted to law enforcement. These actions are not just immoral, they are criminal. Justice is coming." Peter lunged forward, his face red with fury. "This is ridiculous. None of this is true," he shouted, his voice cracking. Mrs. Johnson tried to maintain her composure, but her shaking hands betrayed her. "You'll regret this, Scarlett," she hissed. "You're making a mistake." I stood firm, meeting their venomous stares with calm resolve. "The only mistake I made was trusting you," I said. "But that ends tonight." As security escorted Peter and Mrs. Johnson out of the hall, the audience broke into applause. Friends and colleagues approached me with words of encouragement and support. For the first time in years, I felt free. This event wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about reclaiming my life and proving that even in the face of betrayal, I could rise above. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was no longer defined by their cruelty, but by my own strength. And as the night came to a close, I looked around the room, surrounded by those who believed in me, and felt a profound sense of peace. I had finally taken control of my story. As the recording ended, the room remained silent, the tension palpable. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "This was my life," I said, gesturing toward the screen. "This is what I endured behind closed doors. What you all saw was a carefully crafted facade. Tonight, I'm pulling back the curtain." I clicked the remote again, and the next slide appeared, a detailed analysis of financial transactions that Detective Hayes had uncovered. The room collectively gasped as the evidence of embezzlement and fraud came into focus. Transfers between Peter's and Mrs. Johnson's accounts, funds siphoned from unsuspecting clients. It was all there, laid out in black and white. "This is not just about emotional abuse," I continued, my voice rising with conviction. "Peter and Mrs. Johnson have been involved in fraudulent activities, betraying the trust of their clients and everyone who believed in them." Peter stood abruptly, his face red with fury. "Scarlett, stop this nonsense," he shouted. "You're trying to ruin me out of spite." The crowd turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. Mrs. Johnson remained seated, her face pale but her eyes burning with anger. "Ruin you?" I said, locking eyes with Peter. "No, Peter. You ruined yourself. I'm simply exposing the truth." The next slide revealed email correspondence between Mrs. Johnson and Peter, planning their fraudulent schemes. Mrs. Johnson finally broke her silence, her voice sharp and defensive. "This is absurd. You're twisting things to make us look bad." I held my ground, unwavering. "These are your emails, your words. The evidence speaks for itself." Detective Hayes stepped forward, addressing the room. "The evidence has been shared with the authorities, and formal charges are being filed. What you've seen tonight is just the beginning of the case against Peter and Mrs. Johnson." The room erupted in murmurs, and I saw several guests shaking their heads in disbelief. Peter attempted to storm toward the stage, but security intercepted him, escorting him out of the venue. Mrs. Johnson followed, her face a mask of barely contained rage. As they were removed from the room, I turned back to the crowd, my voice softer now but still firm. Tonight is about more than exposing the truth. It's about reclaiming my voice, my power, and my life. Thank you for being here to witness this moment. The guests erupted into applause, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and empowerment. Friends and supporters approached me with words of encouragement, their kindness reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. As the night drew to a close, I stood in the now empty hall, reflecting on everything that had led me to this moment. The journey had been painful and harrowing, but I had emerged stronger, determined to rebuild my life on my own terms. This was not just an ending, it was a new beginning. I had finally found my strength, and I would never let anyone take it away again. As the weight of the evidence sank into the room, I stood at the podium, letting the silence speak volumes. Every face in the crowd told a story: shock, disgust, sympathy, and, from a few, quiet admiration. Peter and Mrs. Johnson's attempts to maintain their composure had failed miserably. Peter, usually so smug and self-assured, now looked like a trapped animal, his pale face betraying his fear. Mrs. Johnson's anger boiled beneath the surface, her forced smile gone as she realized there was no escaping the truth. I addressed the crowd one final time. "This isn't just about me. It's about accountability." Too often, abusers and manipulators hide behind wealth and influence, thinking they're untouchable. But no one is above the truth. The room erupted into applause, some polite, others more emphatic. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. Peter, his voice breaking, tried to salvage what was left of his reputation. "This is all fabricated. None of this is true." But Detective Hayes stepped forward, holding up a folder of official documents. "The evidence has already been submitted to law enforcement. Investigations are underway, and formal charges are pending. Running from this won't help you, Mr. Johnson." Peter glared at the detective, but didn't say another word. He grabbed Mrs. Johnson's arm, trying to leave discreetly, but the crowd had them cornered. Questions from reporters filled the air, their cameras flashing as they captured the fall of the once proud pair. As they were escorted out of the venue, I felt a wave of emotions: relief, vindication, and a quiet sadness for the life I had envisioned that never materialized. But there was also hope, burning brighter than ever. When the last guest left and the lights dimmed, Anna approached me, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Scarlett," she said, hugging me tightly. "You faced them head-on and won." I smiled, feeling a sense of closure beginning to settle over me. "This is just the beginning," I replied. "I'm finally free, and I'm not stopping here." Over the following weeks, the fallout from the event spread like wildfire. The recordings and financial documents were covered by local news outlets, tarnishing Peter and Mrs. Johnson's reputations beyond repair. Their fraudulent activities led to criminal charges, and I learned that several of their victims were now seeking restitution. For me, life took a new turn. I poured my energy into rebuilding, focusing on my well-being and surrounding myself with people who truly cared for me. The ordeal had been harrowing, but it had also revealed my strength and resilience. In time, I found peace. My story wasn't one of defeat, but of triumph, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way to reclaim your power and rewrite your narrative. And as I moved forward, I did so with the knowledge that I was finally in control of my life. In the weeks following the courtroom victory, life began to take on a new rhythm. The media attention waned, and Peter and Mrs. Johnson's downfall became yesterday's news. But for me, the journey was far from forgotten. Each step toward rebuilding my life was a testament to my strength and determination. Moving to a serene home outside Austin marked a significant turning point. Nestled among rolling hills and bathed in golden sunsets, the new space felt like a fresh canvas. For the first time in years, I felt free from the shadows of manipulation and abuse that had once loomed so large. I threw myself into building the life I had always dreamed of. I started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of emotional and financial abuse, using my story to inspire others. I connected with women from all walks of life, hearing their stories and sharing my own journey of resilience. Each conversation reaffirmed my belief that even the most broken lives could be rebuilt with courage and support. My days became a blend of quiet reflection and meaningful work. In the mornings, I sipped coffee on my porch, surrounded by the gentle sounds of nature. In the evenings, I worked on my nonprofit, determined to make a difference. One evening, as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace. The storm that had consumed my life was over, and in its wake, I had discovered an unshakable inner strength. The journey hadn't been easy. There were moments of despair, anger, and doubt. But through it all, I had found my voice, reclaimed my power, and learned that even in the face of betrayal and heartbreak, it was possible to rise again. The future stretched out before me, filled with endless possibilities. And as I closed my eyes that evening, I felt the gentle hum of hope, proof that no matter how dark the past may seem, the light ahead can always shine brighter.